Hey friends, welcome to the course. My name is Dr. Joe. I'm trying something different here actually with my slides where you can see me as well as see the slides because research indicates that seeing a human face helps you retain information a little bit better. So we'll see how that goes. Today's slides we're going to walk through our introduction to research design and just kind of laying some fundamentals down there, making sure you have some good vocab and this way getting a good start to the course. But I want to make sure that the terms that we need are already in place. So when we mention things, of course, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. So I always like to start with a table of contents. We'll talk about terminology, what the job of research really is, what research has to have to be effective. I like to call it a cookbook for good research. So what are the ingredients that we have to put into it? And then kind of going more philosophical about the idea of science and religion and how they meet together in the form of psychology and also parsimony as kind of the antithesis of where we want to be with regard to research. So kind of a breakdown of what we'll cover in today's chats. So some terminology, let's lay this out. Study, experiment, research, technically they all mean something slightly different, but for the sake of this course, we will use them quite interchangeably, synonymously, right? So a study or an experiment or a piece of research is essentially the same thing. There are nuances. We'll talk later in the course about a full experiment versus a quasi-experiment, but overall, they tend to be used very interchangeably, particularly in the case of this study, or this class. Subjects, participants, respondents. Once again, fairly synonymous. Actually, they mean almost exactly the same thing. People are kind of moving away from using the term subject, particularly with regard to human beings. Likewise, participants isn't considerably used a great deal anymore. It's more respondents or there's other very PC terms used for it. I don't think any of them is necessarily derogatory. They're not demeaning to call a human subject a subject, but people are kind of moving away from that. For the sake of this course, of course, we will actually be using all three fairly interchangeably. And once again, no offense to human beings, but subject I think is a suitable term. Control group, actually I'm going to put these on there at the same time. Control group and experimental group. When we're doing research, of course, there is a group typically that will receive a certain treatment or condition or manipulation. These are the terms that we'll use as well. So that's the experimental group, the group that is receiving something, whether it be caffeine in the case of testing what coffee does to study habits, or any number of examples. Basically, they're the group that is receiving something. I think the textbook uses the term receiving a non-zero level of something, right? So the control group, by contrast, is the group that receives a zero level of something. So the example I like to use is if I'm looking at how caffeine impacts exam scores on general psychology students, my experimental group will receive a 20-ounce cup of coffee prior to taking the exam, right? So I'm measuring how much coffee they're going to get. They're getting this specific amount, right? So the experimental group will receive 20 ounces of coffee as part of my research. The control group, by contrast, will receive no coffee. In fact, they might actually, in the study, I might actually commit them to not drinking any coffee at all that day, right? So the control group gets nothing, gets a zero level of the coffee and therefore the caffeine, whereas the experimental group will receive 20 ounces of the coffee and therefore the caffeine. That's how it's going to lay out. That's a very simple example, but we'll talk more about that. Random selection and random assignment, and people get these wires crossed very easily. Random selection should come first, then random assignment, right? And random selection is just as it sounds. How do you select who is going to be part of your study? So, this could be a lottery system. For example, if we did a study here at HBU, we could do a lottery system of H numbers and randomly select, I don't know why I'm doing randomly, it should be random with a lottery system, randomly select 100 participants to be part of our study. That is true random selection because it's a lottery system and everyone at HBU has an equal chance of being selected to be participants in the study. Random assignment is the next phase of the research. In that case, what I'm doing is once again using a lottery system, ideally using like H numbers, for example, and I'm going to split the participants in potentially to two groups, right? So using the caffeine example we just talked about, you would be randomly assigned, once you're in the study, once you're part of the 100 that will be in the study, I would take 50 and randomly assign them to the experimental group, who receives 20 ounces of coffee, and then randomly assign the other 50 to the control group, who receives no coffee, right? And the reason why I do both random selection and random assignment is because I'm trying to reduce bias, okay? Bias, B-I-A-S. Reducing bias is one of the fundamental tasks of designing and conducting good research, and we'll talk a lot more about that throughout the course. But random selection first, then random assignment. Studies do not have to have either one, actually. They're kind of seen as optional, which we'll talk about how that differs with study design, but that's how they're going to flow out. Findings and, there we go, findings and conclusions. Let's separate these, okay? I want to be very clear from the very beginning about this point. Findings are the actual statistical analysis outcomes, right? Findings are fact. They are irrefutable. It is what the data says. It's basically the data and the analysis that you conduct off of the data, right? So if you and I have the same data set and we both run a correlation analysis, for example, your results and my results will look the same because findings are concrete, okay? They are above reproach. And this is what will go in like chapter 4 of your thesis, right? So this is the results section. However, conclusions are your chapter 5. What do the results mean, right? And that requires some degree of subjectivity, right? So let's say we run an analysis and we find that women scored higher on an IQ test than men, right? We could say in chapter 4 that the data indicated that women showed higher levels of IQ than men, right? And this is fact. If you've got the data to back it up, you cannot argue that. The facts indicate that women scored higher on IQ tests than men, right? And while that might rub some men the wrong way, findings cannot be contested, really, as long as they're accurate and not falsified in any way, right? However, conclusions take those results and interpret them, right? So you could say the data seem to indicate that women are smarter than men, right? That is a sustainable conclusion. However, that could still be contested because people would say, but you only did one study to support that. And you only sampled a certain number of men and women. There are approximately 4 billion men and 4 billion women in the world. That's not a very good sample. So conclusions can be attacked or critiqued based on the fact that they are an extension, a subjective extension of the results. Conclusions are what you'll find in chapter 5. And we'll talk more about that as well. So what do we even do in research? What's the point of research? And actually, let me kind of take a step back. First of all, the number one obligation for researchers is to protect the rights of participants. Start that in your notes. We'll actually talk about that ad nauseum in the ethics section of this course. But let's start with it in this slide here. We are trying to protect the rights of participants first and foremost, whether they be human or animal or whatever. We're making sure that we put their concerns first, right? Period, end of sentence. Beyond that, after we've settled all that, right, we're essentially trying to test a hypothesis. And a lot of research is going to be based on an if-then sort of statement. If I give students coffee, then they will score higher on an exam, all right, to use the example we used on the last slide. And essentially what we're doing is trying to see how two variables interact. As coffee levels go up, or rather as caffeine levels go up, what happens to exam scores? Right? It's possible that the higher caffeine level might reduce exam scores, but the study will show us that, right? And you notice it says on that fourth bullet point there, reduce or eliminate other variables that might interfere with the tested relationship. It's not in this slide because we'll talk about it later on in the course, but the term for this is confound. C-O-N-F-O-U-N-D, confound. We're actually trying to reduce the number of confounds that might be in the study. Right? And an example of this in the caffeine study we've just talked about is maybe students drink coffee before they even come to class, right? That is a confound. If they come to class and they've already had 20 ounces of coffee, then already they're confounding the results because they've already been exposed to coffee, right? So what we might do is make them promise or swear or whatever. We might try and prevent them from drinking any coffee before they come into the study. This way, we can manipulate the caffeine variable more directly. That would be reducing a confound, right? We can never fully eliminate all confounds. All research has confounds. That's something else to add to your notes. All research you will ever read has confounds. In fact, some of our exams, I think all of our exams in this course, ask you what confounds might be found in the research study we're discussing. All research has confounds, period, okay? Last statement, and you can tell I'm really adamant about this. Provide support for a given hypothesis. Research is about providing support for a hypothesis, not proof. I can't emphasize that enough. Not proof. We're not trying to prove anything in our research or establish proof. We're simply providing support or evidence for a hypothesis. Okay? And what this does is, there's a philosophical element of this too, is we want to make sure we stay humble. Just because we have research that indicates A doesn't mean that A is fact. In fact, we might find other studies that indicate B, right? So what we're essentially trying to do is establish evidence in terms of what the research is pointing at and how we might provide viable conclusions about the data we found, as opposed to establishing proof and closing the book on a particular topic. So some things that we want to keep in mind as we move through this segment of the course too. Parsimony. It's a term you might actually not have heard of, which is good because I hate it. It is essentially the idea that the simplest explanation is best. And I hate this as a concept. It's actually a usable concept in things like biology or chemistry and hard sciences, but in social sciences like psychology, I think it's a terrible idea. It's also sometimes referred to as the principle of economy, principle of unnecessary plurality, principle of simplicity, or Occam's razor. Right? And you guys might have also heard the acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid. That's parsimony. And the reason why I don't like this is because I feel like human behavior is never parsimonious. There's never one explanation for why we do something or why we think something. There's always a very complex structure behind both our thoughts and our behaviors. So parsimony to me is a moot point here. We are not trying to be parsimonious. In fact, we're trying to go the other direction. We're trying to delve deep and see how complex the explanation could be. And thus, I would invite you not to be parsimonious, but rather embrace plausible rival hypotheses, right? What this essentially does is accept the idea that there might be several potential explanations for what we're examining and not ruling anything out, even if we have evidence to support another idea, right? So I am a creationist, for example, but I don't rule out the possibility of evolution as an explanation for how human beings came to exist, right? Plausible rival hypothesis simply means you're just keeping your mind open. And a good scientist, not just a behavioral scientist, but a good scientist keeps their mind open to other potentials, right? I've already mentioned this in the previous slide, but I want to reiterate because it fits in this point here too. Findings and conclusions are two separate things. Findings are data and they are objective, whereas conclusions are subjective because we're interpreting the data. It's interpretive, right? Thus, we're providing our own perspective and our own potential bias to it, although we're trying to reduce that a great deal, right? So just the idea with this course is always keep your mind open. Always keep your mind open to other potential explanation as to why someone does something or why a group of people says something or thinks a certain way. So a cookbook for good research. Actually, I'm going to go and stop the video here so that we can move on to the second segment, because if I get this ball rolling, there's no stopping it. But let me just point out as I close this segment of our video, these are going to be the ingredients on how we create good research. They're not all required, but ideally they would be there so that the research is viable. And when I say good research, I probably should have put that in quotes. Good research is well designed, well executed, well analyzed, and then well concluded. So there's more like 4 stages of how research can be good. And at any stage, there can be something that throws the research off. It might have been poorly designed at the very beginning. It might be bad research there. It might be poorly executed, which is also a potential, right? The results and the discussion aspect of it, the findings and the conclusions could also go awry. And actually in the ethics chapter, we're going to talk more about how research can be bad, what makes research bad. But I will say, let me conclude on this thought for this segment of the lecture, is this is not everyone gets a trophy, right? So if you cannot do the research well, it is better that you don't do it than doing it to your best ability. Good ability or trying your best does not fit in with research. Do your research well or do not do it. To end this, I'm going to leave you with the thoughts of Yoda from Star Wars. Do or do not, there is no try.